Hey guys and girls, welcome back to another beautiful video on this beautiful channel on this beautiful day. How you guys and girls doing? I hope you're doing great as always. Today's video is fully packed with animation, all kinds of stuff to make the game look a lot better. It's going to be really fun. We're going to do running and jumping animations, all that stuff, and connect it all together so it looks really nice. So I hope you're ready and let's get started. Now, before we get going, I just want to fix one thing that I didn't fix in the last video, and that is that jump count is still public. And it kind of helped us in the last video to not have to switch to debug to see what's going on with jump count. But now that we know it's working, I want to set it back to private and I want to set my max jump count to 1. So in our script here, let's go ahead and find that jump count variable. And you'll see we have serialized field here. So I'm just going to remove that and make sure that it is private. Usually I always keep my variables private. Rigid body isn't private, so I'm going to add that here. And just a few fixes from the previous videos. Same thing for sprite renderer, just to keep it consistent. And if you ever notice me not using a private or if I forget because I'm clumsy, go ahead and use private anyway. Keep it as a rule of thumb to make these private. Now, once we've corrected our previous mistakes or my previous mistakes, let's go ahead and create a folder to keep all of our animations. So I'm just going to create a new folder and I'm going to call it animations. I'm going to go ahead and go in here and create another folder called player, open that, and then where we want to create our animations. Now it consists of, or each animation and everything consists of 2 pieces. So it's an animation controller and there's animations. Now hopefully you can guess what that is. If you have an animator or animation controller, you can control several animations. So they're a piece of a bigger puzzle basically. And you'll see that in the inspector. Once we start animating, adding things, you'll see an animator pop up here and that we can use that animator to then work with the player and animate the player through the code. So firstly, you want to select your player if you haven't done that already. And you know that by checking the hierarchy tab, or all this stuff will pop up here in the scene view, or you'll see the player pop up in the inspector. And once you're here, I want you to go to Window, Animation, and click on Animation, not Animator, but Animation. They're 2 different tabs. The Animator, like I said, controls all of the individual animations, but we first have to create animations so that we can add them to the player and use them in the animator. So if you have the player selected, there will be a create button here. So I'm just going to go ahead and create. And this little dialog will pop up to tell me where to put all my stuff. And we're already in the assets animation player. So I'm going to start off with a player idle animation and I'll save that. Once that's done, you'll see clearly that it's saved. But you'll also see in your projects tab that you have a player animator and an animation that you just created, the player idle one. And this animator will always pop up. If I click on it, you'll see that it's an animator controller. And if I double click that, the animator window will show up, or the one that I told you not to open before. And we'll get to this, so don't worry about all this stuff. It looks weird, but I promise you it's very simple. It's really easy to use, intuitive. But let's keep the animator just in the background for now. And I'll put the animation tab down here so that we can quickly animate stuff and see that in the scene view. So if you have your scene tab open, you can see the animation real time as you place the frames, and then you can play your animation right here. And you can even record them using a keyframe recording mode, but we're not going to go through that now. We're going to add the frames manually. So if I click my player again and I just go to projects, and you'll see your files here. So to start animating our first animation, what we need to do is we need to find the sprites for our player. So I'll go to my projects tab, I'll go to Sunnyland, sprites, player, and you'll see the creator nicely organize everything for us. So we'll go jump into idle here, and then you'll see our 4 sprites. And we do have animations and an animator here, so I'm just going to delete these. So we're not going to need those. We just want our sprites. And I'll take the animator window and I'll place it to the right here, just so I can see both of these at the same time, because I want to drag my frames into the animation tab just so they can create an animation for us. So I'm going to go to my animations player here, and I'm going to click on my player, and this is where our animation is going to be created. So firstly, I'm just going to create one, and you'll see that it opens up this dialog where I can choose what to name it and where to create it. So I'll name it player idle, and I'll save that here, and you'll see that 2 things pop up. An animator pops up and a animation pops up, but the animation is empty, but you can see in the little drop down here what that animation name is. If I go to my scene view, I can click on the player and I can open the drop down and create several clips here, new animations. So this is important to know that a bunch of animations will be created with one animation controller. So let's find our idle sprites again and keep the animation open. Make sure you click on your player, keep the animation tab open, and let's drag the first frame in here. So once I do that, and I run this, nothing's going to happen because basically that's the first frame. It's already on the first frame. The next thing we want to do is we want to add the second one. I'm going to add it at 0.10. You can control the speed of the animation by putting each frame closer to one another, or you can move them further away from one another, which will make it slower. And the animation runs at 60 frames per second. So that way you can control the speed. And also you can control the speed in the animator itself. So if you click on any animation here, you can control the speed in the inspector. And you'll see that the player idle is set to entry. And that means that whenever the animation starts or the animation controller starts, it will make sure that the first animation that runs is whatever is connected to this entry box. So we're not going to talk too much about all of this right now. So I want you to know that this exists and that you can select an animation in here. So let's go back to our scene view, and I'm going to zoom out here a little bit. And I'm going to click on the player, and I'm going to run this. And you'll see the player is jittering about. And that's perfectly normal since we just have 2 frames, right? But at least it's working. So now I'm going to go back and add more of these to 0.20 and 0.30. And I'm going to run this, and you'll see the player it's working, but it's a little weird. It feels like it's missing something. So what we need to do is that this frame jumps directly to this frame. So the player jumps up. So what I usually do is add the first frame again right after the last frame, so the player goes back to where he was and then it continues. So it looks a lot more smooth if you look at this. So that's good. Now we have our first animation created. Let's go ahead and play our game. Since the animator is already added to the player, it will make sure the idle animation runs at start. So you'll see our player has a nice idle animation, just chilling, just waiting. And let's click on the player and look at that animator component. So here you go. It automatically created that for us, and that controls all the animations for our player. So the next thing we want to do is we want to create a jump animation and a run animation. But I'm going to start off with run. So I'm going to go into my animation tab again, click my player, and I'll go to create new clip. And I'll name this player run. And you'll see that it's at the wrong spot because that's what I have opened here in my assets folder. So I'm just going to go ahead into assets, animations, player, and don't overwrite that. I want to just call this run and save that. And we have a new empty animation. Let's fill this with the run. So I'll go back here and I'll open the run folder in my assets. I'll do the same thing here. I'll delete these files for the animations. And I want to make sure that I do one thing. I want to click on all of these and I want to fix the sprite because it's not correct for us right now. So I'll do pixels per unit 16 if you remember that. And that's pretty much it for this one. Everything else was set correctly. So I'll do that and I'll click my player again, select the run and start animating run. So I'll add this to the first frame, second frame, third frame, fourth, fifth, and sixth. Put that a little wrong there. Make sure it's at 50. And if you hold and drag it, you can see the number of what's happening. So there we go. Now we have a run animation. I made it a little faster by moving everything to 0.05 and everything like that. So this looks a lot better. And it doesn't look jittery to me. So we'll keep it like this without adding the frame at the end. So what the frame at the end does is just that the first frame becomes a little longer so it doesn't look that jittery. I can even remove it in the idle one. But I think this animation is a little too jittery by itself in the way it's made. But the run animation is fine. So this way, the idle animation is fixed and the run animation looks good as well. Good. So now we have 2 animations. If I go to my animator, I'll see I have a run animation as well. But how are we going to use this? Well, that we'll get to in a little bit after we animate our jump as well. So now we're going to animate the jumping and the falling, and this is going to be really easy. I'm going to create 2 animations. I'm going to say player jump. First of all, I'm going to select both of these, fall and jump, and I'm going to set this to 16 pixels per unit, just like we did with the run. Apply that. Everything else is correct. Once that's done, since this is the jump, it's just going to be 1 frame. So I'm going to add that frame right here, and I'm going to save that. And then I'm going to create another one, and I'm going to call it player fall, and just save that. And then add the fall frame to that and save it. And our player was already selected in the scene tab. That's why we could do all that. So now we have 4 of these and it's not really going to do anything. There's just a fall and I go to jump, play that. It's just a jump frame. So once we've done that, we can start using the animator to connect all of these together. So it's going to be a little bit of a chore to connect all of these together, but I'm going to do my best. So firstly, I'm just going to move these a little bit here. So I'm going to do jump here and fall. And you can select all of these by dragging and clicking. And exit we'll put down here. So we're not going to think about that. But entry goes into idle. That's perfect. Like I said before, this will just tell Unity what animation should start as the first animation. And where do we go from there? Well, we'll right click the player idle and we'll make a transition, and that will allow us to create an arrow to whatever we want. So I'll start off by adding one to player run, and then we can just go ahead and select that transition, and we'll see a bunch of options here. Now you can smooth things together. You have a bunch of options to change how the transition occurs. But for us, we just want it to be instantaneous. So I'm going to remove has exit time, and I'm going to remove the duration of the transition so it's instantaneous. Conditions is something we'll get to in just a second. But now we created a transition here. But how do we get to that? That's what conditions are for. So if I run my game now, you'll see that we won't automatically go from idle to running because Unity doesn't know what's going on. It doesn't know what it should look for to change that animation state. And that's just what these are. These are states. So firstly, I just want this to work. To do that, we have something on the left side here called parameters. And parameters will connect whatever is going on in our code and our game to the animator. It will give us a link between the two. So to create a first link, you have a few different things you can choose between. You can do booleans, integers, floats, and triggers. I'll use a float because I want the velocity to control whether the animation is set to running or not. And what is the run animation? Well, it's in the horizontal axis. So the X velocity is what I'm looking at. And we'll keep that to 0 at default. We'll tell the transition that, okay, in order for this transition to happen, we want you to look at the X velocity and we want it to be greater than 0.1. And I'll get to why we're setting it to 0.1 and not 0 in just a minute. So if I run this now, still, hopefully you understand that nothing's going to happen. No run state. Well, why? Why is that not happening? Well, we're never setting this parameter anywhere in our code. It still doesn't know what's going on. So if I open my code, we're going to add the animator here just so we can access that, since that's where the parameter exists and that's where we want to set it. So I'm just going to say private animator player animator, and we'll set that to null. Let's go to our wake and we'll say player animator equals get component animator, like that. And we'll go to the late update, and at the bottom here, we're just going to switch stuff around. We're going to tell the animator what the current value of something is, what to set to the parameter. So I'll say if player animator is not null, let us set the parameter we just created. So player animator dot set, since we're setting something, we'll set a float value. And first we need to tell it what float value we want to set. And here it's really important to remember the name of your parameter. So we set it to X velocity. And if this isn't spelled correctly, it won't be able to find the parameter. So it's really important. Now, what do we want to send into that parameter? Well, we want to send the velocity of the player. So player rigid body 2D, which keeps all the velocity and everything, dot velocity dot X. There you go. Once we've set this, now the animator knows what the X velocity parameter is, and then it can use that to switch the animations. So when running this, you'll see that the player runs without a problem. But what happens when I let go? Well, it's not stopping and it's stuck in that state. And we can open the animator and we'll see what's going on. Well, it doesn't have a way to get back to idle. Once you get here, it doesn't know what it should do. Well, it will stay there. We want a way to go back to idle when our velocity is less than 0.1. So let's go ahead and add that transition in our animator, make transition right back to player idle, and we'll have to do the same thing here. Uncheck exit time, set that to 0, add the condition for X velocity. Since that's the only one we have, it automatically adds that. Otherwise, you can select them here, and then we'll say less than 0.1. And I'll show you why still it's 0.1 in just a second. I haven't explained that yet, but don't worry, I'll get to that. So if I run this now, you'll see that the player stops, but when I run to the left, nothing's happening. So I want you to remember that if we look at our scene view here, well, it doesn't really tell us much, but if I do this and I select the player, you'll see that we have an X direction. Now there's a negative and a positive direction, if you remember that correctly. The same for every axis. So there's a negative and a positive. And what is happening is that since we're checking for greater than 0 for running, if I select that transition, well, that's to the right. And if I do less than, anything less than 0.1, which is a positive value, it will go to idle. So when we're running to the left, our velocity is actually greater than 0, but in the left direction, which is a negative value. So what we want to do is we want to keep it simple. We don't want to have to create a bunch of extra states for running left and running right and all that stuff. What we want to do is we just want to have one here. I want to make sure that the X velocity is always positive, even though we're running to the left. How can we do that? Well, when the player is running left, the value is still the same, but it's a negative value of that positive value. What we can do is we can remove the minus by using something called math f.abs, and it returns an absolute value of whatever float you give it. So I'm going to say abs, and I'm going to put the velocity x within that. So whatever happens now, the value of this will be absolute. So it will always be positive. Now if I run this, you'll see that it's working on both directions. If I stop, it will stop running. There you go. So now we have a run animation, which looks pretty nice. And the 0.1 is basically that if we say less, if we kept this to 0 and we said greater than 0, that's fine. But if we want to go back to idle, we'll have to set this to less than 0, which doesn't make sense since we have a positive value only, and the least this can be is 0. It can't be less than 0. So we won't ever get back to idle. That's why we have a slightly larger number here just to make that happen. Great. So now we have a run animation. So now we want to animate the rest of the stuff. We want this to be complete. And I'm going to do this and not explain too much more because what I've shown you between player idle to run is basically what we're going to be doing. We're just going to add a few more parameters to be able to jump and then fall and run. So to make all this work together, we're going to have to create a whole bunch of these transitions between everything. And I'll try to explain it as well as I can as we go. But let's just keep it simple and start by adding another float variable and call it y velocity, since we're going to be dealing with jumping. And then we're going to add a Boolean calling it is ground. So let's start with the idle to jump. This transition, let's remove this as always. And I'm always going to remove the exit time and set the duration to 0, just so you know. So I'm going to do that without explaining too much. And how do we go from idle to jump? Well, we're going to check if something called is ground is false. So whenever we're in the air from this, we'll know that it should be in the jump animation. Very simple. Then we want to create a transition from idle to falling. And this would be if you would run off, or if something would happen while you're idle, something would drop below your feet. It would go direct from idle to falling. Remove all this. Let's add the condition. And this is also when the ground is false. But here we're going to add y velocity is less than 0. And the y velocity isn't going to be an absolute value like we had before, because here we actually want to know if we're going up or down depending on jumping, or if we're falling. So here we have it less than 0. Then the player will go from idle to falling. Now, important one is run to jump. So while we're running, we want to be able to jump from a running state. And this will be the opposite of falling. It's going to be if we are not on the ground and our y velocity is greater than 0. So if you remember, when we hit jump, it adds to the velocity with whatever jump force we have, and that will be a positive direction. And if we're running and we happen to fall down, or we fall off a ledge or anything, then we want that animation as well. That would be if we're not on the ground and our y velocity is less than 0. And I really want you to pay close attention to what I'm doing, because if you miss one of these and if you miss something here, your whole system could be messed up. So really just go through these and check that you've done it correctly. Now we want to create a few transitions back to wherever they came from. So from player jump to idle would be if we were to hit the ground. There you go. Then is ground would be set to true. And if we were to jump and go to falling from that, now that looks a little weird, so I'm going to put falling to the right here just so we can see what's going on. Make it a little easier on the eyes here. And this is something that is kind of hard to do, is to put all of your states nicely so that you can see them easily. It's really hard, especially when you have a lot of states. So it could be good to space them out a little bit at least, just so you see where the arrows are going. So jump to fall would be if we are not on the ground while jumping, and our y velocity would be less than 0. And we're soon done here. But we got a few more, just 3 more to do. So from falling to running, I want to go back here. That's if we do hit the ground and our x velocity is greater than 0, then we could, since we have double jumps and triple jumps, we could go from falling to jumping again, which would be if our is ground is false and our y velocity is now greater than 0 instead. So we'll go right back up. So this would be less than, and this would be greater than. And then the final one is from falling to idle, which would be if we're on the ground and our x velocity is less than 0.1. And we just need to double check. So I made a mistake here from falling to running. It should be 0.1. Remember that. Anything to do with the run would be 0.1 and not 0. So less than 0, well, this is y velocity, sorry. So that's fine, but the x velocity is 0.1. So this is how it should look at the end. So now when we have all of these, we just need to set the parameters again here for 2 more parameters. So we had the X velocity. We're going to set the Y velocity as well. And I'm going to remove the math absolute value here. And I'm going to just set it to the raw Y value of the velocity. And then we had is ground, which is just the basic is ground variable that we already have. And we'll do set bool here so that is correct. And now we have our 3 values being set in the late update. So let's go ahead and run this now, and hopefully everything should work just fine. So you'll see I'm running and I can jump and I can fall. And if I just do that from standing still, or if I run off a ledge, just like that, looks clean. So just to end the video now, hopefully you liked this video. It's been okay. It's been a little long. It's been a little convoluted with all the arrows and everything, but let's just go through it really quickly as an end here. So you can see this is what it looks like. Let's go ahead into our scene view and just see what we got. So if I stop the game here, we have our animator here added after we added all our animations. We have our movement controller. Now I forgot to add the animator into this. I'll do that, but it still gets it in the script, so it's not a really big problem, but it's nice to just have it clear here. And if we go into our animator, we have all our states and our arrows. So if we go into our states here, you'll see there's a speed. You can do whatever speed you want for your animations. I'll keep them at 1. Doesn't really matter that much to me right now. It's more important to show you guys how it works. So if you click on an animation, you can also see the transitions between all the states. Sometimes it's hard, like I said, with arrows. So you can see your transitions here, and you can click them and you can see what's going on. So just make sure this is how it looks for you. I'm just going to go through them all now at the end just so it's correct. So start from idle to player 1. This is how it should look. Next one is to jump from idle. This is how it should look. This is from idle to falling. Remember the Y velocity should be less than 0 here. Let's go to the next state, which is running. So let's click on that. Now, if I want to go back to idle, basically it should be the X velocity. Remember, anytime the X velocity is being used here, we want to do 0.1 just because it's a absolute value. The next one is to jumping. This is how it should look. And this is from running to falling. Go to jump. We have 2 transitions here. So we go to idle and we go to falling from jumping. And finally, we have the fall. So from falling to running, from falling to jumping when you're doing the double jump, and from falling to being idle. And there you go. That's all the transitions. Just wanted to make sure you got those correct. Remember to remove the has exit time and the transition duration for all of these transitions, and it should look really clean and nice, at least for our game. There are times where you need to use these, but not for us. And these are the parameters you're going to use. So again, hopefully that was helpful and you learned something and you got a working animation. It's a really neat system. It's really good and really easy to use. So go ahead and work with this, play around with it, set the speeds to what you want. And yeah, I'll see you guys in the next one. Bye-bye.